guys, today we're going to talk about evidences of evolution. You should have already watched the geologic era video that you probably missed because of COVID break last year. But now I want to talk about something that builds on that. So I needed you to watch that. So hopefully you did. If you didn't, you might want to go and watch that before you begin, because we're going to start with the fossil record. Now, these things we're going to talk about today are evidence that evolution is occurring and has occurred over time. So right now I want you to grab your notebook, turn it sideways if you need to. I don't know what kind of notebook you have, but you need a lot of space sideways, and create a notes sheet that looks like mine. I'm going to just go ahead and let you pause it, so I'm not going to wait here, but go ahead and pause the video and so that you can see the sheet and make a copy of it just like mine. Now that you've done that, we are going to take a little bit of time to fill in each box or circle on your chart, okay? And you're going to need to go and read your textbook or page through it anyway and make sure each of the vocab terms that you're responsible for are actually written on your notes. So don't miss anything. But first, I thought I'd give you a few notes myself because that's how I prefer to get information, but you might prefer it out of a textbook. So first thing we're going to talk about is the age-old, no pun intended, evidence of evolution. That's the fossil record. When Darwin was looking in South America and then on the Galapagos Islands, he found a lot of fossils that were undisturbed because it wasn't a very inhabited place, and they looked like the animals that were walking around. What we call extant. Extant is the opposite of extinct. So they were what we call extant species. But in the ground, the fossils weren't quite like them, but they were similar. That was part of the reason that Darwin began to think that life had been changing over time and began to put together this natural selection with the evolution piece that already was kind of in place. And so the fossil record is very, very good information for us. Basically, what it tells us is the lower it is down into the ground, the lower you find the fossil, the longer time has gone by. And we can see from the fossil record changes that have been made throughout time. We can see that there are organisms that are very similar to ones that we have now, and even similar to other organisms in the fossil record, but either below or above in the strata layers. And we can even now do some carbon dating to figure out the relative age of the organisms, which helps us to see how organisms have been changing and when those changes were made. So right now, pause the video and summarize how the fossil record might help you as an evolutionary student figure out if evolution is happening. Remember, these are evidences of evolution. So how could the fossil record help you to determine that, in fact, changes are happening in the phenotypes or the physical appearance of species? Go ahead and pause and do that. Okay, I hope that you got that you'd be able to see small changes or large changes throughout the years based on where they were buried or how they were buried in the fossil record and in the layers, which represent, of course, the different eras of time. And also in the textbook, there's more information for you, so pick it up there. Next is biogeography. Biogeography is kind of fun because it's like life geography. So basically where life is. And in this picture, you can see fossil remains. So you can see that there are some that stretch between continents, which is kind of indicating that Pangea, when all the continents were together, is actually, it's like evidence of that. And of course, those changes are very helpful. But what we can also see is that in these changes, we have some species that cross that were like in Africa and South America, but they're slightly different. And so while we would expect those species to be the same because we find fossils where Pangea was together, now that it's all separate into different continents, we see similar species in different continents, and yet they're not the same as each other. So over time, because those species were so separated, there's been changes that have happened that have ended up making them completely different species. So like Australia has a lot of marsupials, organisms that have pouches. However, those organisms have very similar relatives in other continents. We just know that over time, this is an evidence of evolution, that over time, those organisms have changed. And so now they're slightly different in Australia than they are, say, in India or some of the other places where those occur. So that is an evidence of evolution, that in geography, where you can find where life was, it seems like They were once together, the continents were together. When they split, some of the organisms were in both places, and then they've changed. And so that kind of helps us to see that. Use your textbook and this video to summarize in your biogeography place in your notes how biogeography helps us to understand that evolution has been happening and is currently happening. Okay, hopefully you paused and did that, because next we're going to talk about embryology. Embryology is the study of embryos. The study of embryos. So an embryo is something that's growing as it's developing and becoming an organism. An embryo can occur in uterus like it does in mammals, or an embryo can occur and develop in an egg. And that is either way, it's still called an embryo. So embryology is the study of embryos, and I'm going to cover up the answers. These are 8 different embryos for different organisms, and you're going to see them as I uncover each of the layers. You're going to see them start to develop more and more. And I want you to guess which one is the human embryo. Go ahead. There's everything in here from fish to salamanders and pigs and ducks, and there's human. And so I want you to go ahead and commit to one. Decide which one you think is the human. While you're doing that, I want to tell you that the study of embryos helps us to understand evolution, because we can see that as we are forming, we have many common features of some of our relatives. And the closer we get together as far as species go, so the closer our relatives are, the more like our embryos stay as development continues. So right in the very beginning, the embryos are very hard to differentiate between. But as I take off a layer and time has passed in this embryo's development, then you'll see the changes start to take place. So I'm going to take a layer off. All right. So this is now, say, several time later. Of course, for the different embryos, it'll be a different time. You know that pregnancies and egg hatchings and whatnot definitely take different amounts of time. So I can't say this is just 5 weeks later, because it might be 5 weeks for some, but it might be, a day or two for others. So now you've seen, so this is the same. This is the embryo like in the first picture, and then here he is in the second. So likewise, this is the first. So then time passes and it starts looking like that. And that's the first. Time passes and it starts looking, and so on and so forth. Do you know? So this is left is 1 and all the way to the right is 8. Can you tell which one is the human now? Okay. Now I'm uncovering them for you. Okay, so the human actually is this very far one on the right. And you can see there's a rabbit and a calf and a hog and a chick and a tortoise and a salamander and a fish. Now, it's pretty obvious about right here that this probably wasn't the human, but the others are relatively difficult to tell, especially between the rabbit and the human and the calf. So all these 4 right here are mammals. And so we would expect them to look very much alike in embryology, which gives us an evidence that of common ancestry, that at one time that we were all mammals. So we're all related. And at one time we had a common ancestor way in the way back. Okay. So that is why embryology is a evidence of evolution. Go ahead and pause the video and summarize in your notes how embryology helps us to see that evolution is something that's happened. And you can also use your textbook as a reference and make sure you get all of the information there. The last one, and that's a box, is comparative anatomy. Now, comparative anatomy means that we're just going to compare anatomy between species and within a same species and see if there's anything that lends itself to telling us that these used to be more closely like the same, or if there's anything there that helps us to provide evidence for evolution. So these are called homologous structures. Homologous. Logos means relationship and homo means the same. So the same relative. So these basically, this is saying these are from the same family. And so structures that are from the same family or share common ancestry, and please write this term in your notes, structures that share common ancestry show us that evolution is occurring and that we did once have a common ancestor in the way back. And so you can see we have the same bone structure as a cat and a whale and a bat. The blue coating is the phalanges, the green is the metacarpals, the yellow is carpals, orange is ulna and radius are there, orange and peach, and then purple is humerus. Each of these organisms have those same bones, but they're used for different structures. And once you put the skin and fur or whatever on the outside, they wouldn't look a thing alike. But because the structures are the same on the inside, and because they are related to one another, they're all mammals, we call these homologous structures, structures that are the same because they have the same family. Different from that is called vestigial structures. This is vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are ones that no longer serve a purpose that it seems they probably served before. And so I'm going to put up some old drawings here, but I kind of like them. Yeah, and they're not real like high tech, but basically here's a horse bone, and there is a once functional side toe that was a split hoof. And we can look at horse evolution and see a lot of changes in horses in the fossil record. And one was that they used to have a split hoof. Now they have a rudiment or a piece of a toe that looks like it used to be an attachment point for a toe, but a toe is no longer there. Here is a vestigial pelvis and femur, so hip bones and leg that occur in whales. Now, whales with their current weight could have never walked on legs, not with the size they are. But the evolutionary theory says that they used to have the different body structure, and they did. They do have a pelvic area, and they do have this. This is inside the whale, though, so you never see it. You wouldn't know it was there, that they have a pelvis and a femur, which is a leg bone. But it does occur. It's no purpose, serves no purpose for them, but it's an evidence that they used to be structured a little differently than they are now. And then my favorite one is some snakes, not all, but some snakes have this legs and pelvis area inside their skeleton. And so that is an evidence that they used to be different than they are. And remember, evolution is simply a change in the genetics of a population over time. And so really, that's a pretty big change, that whales and snakes used to have some sort of bone structure that would let them walk, almost like a snake would be like a lizard. Okay. Okay, so we call those vestigial structures, structures that once served a purpose that they no longer serve at this time. And that as evidence of change in the population, so evidence of evolution. Finally, if you're going to talk about homologous structures, as in structures that are the same because they're related, you got to talk about analogous structures, a meaning no or not, logos meaning related structures. So these are structures that are formed on organisms because, not because they, here it says right here, similar structured organisms without shared ancestry. So it's not because they're related that their structure is the same, but it's because they have the same environment. And so like we've been doing in class for the last week, we can see that the environment affects the phenotype, because natural selection would dictate that if you have a certain structure, you might be able to survive better in your environment. And if you do, then that structure continues and is passed on. And so we're not sure how the wings might have started way back, but we do know that that would have given them a niche that other organisms didn't have, and therefore they'd be able to outcompete or just compete differently than other organisms so they could live in a different place. And so bats and butterflies and birds have the same kind of structure. They fly, they have wings, but they aren't very closely related to each other. So we call that analogous structures, okay? That's comparative vertebrate anatomy. Pause the video and make sure you have what you need in your notes. So molecular evidence is the final one that I wanted to talk about as far as an evidence of evolution. I put it in a circle in the center of your chart because molecular evidence is the one that really provides the most evidence at this time. It started when we did the Human Genome Project, and then they started, which is basically a project a lot of scientists worked together to sequence DNA in humans to make sure we understood where all the genes were and what all the letters stood for. And then, of course, sequencing of all organisms has begun, and we have some really cool online resources that you can go and look at real DNA sequences. We do that in AP biology, but we don't do that in PreAP. It's too bad. We just don't have time. So this is a chart that's like molecular evidence. So it's telling you that there are 3 different species here: a yeast, which is in the kingdom fungi, a wheat, which is in the kingdom Plantae, and a primate, which is in the kingdom Animalia. And it's showing you that this is cytochrome C, which is a protein that is found in all of these three of these organisms, but is different. So we call that a highly conserved protein, one that is conserved throughout all of the different species. But what you have is three different lines, and they occur like this is the first line, and then it goes on to that, and then there's a third, and then there's the fourth, and that's the end of the protein. So each of these represents an amino acid: glycine, aspirin, valine, glutamine, and you can see that they have highlighted in yellow the places where the proteins are the same. All the other places, they don't line up. But if you look very closely, you'll see that sometimes two of them align while the other one doesn't. And so by this, you can start counting how similar are these two, yeast and wheat, together. How similar are wheat and primate? How similar are primate and yeast? And you can start to figure out which ones are most closely related because of the change in their protein structure, which is closer to the DNA, which is what ultimately is changing to change the outward appearance. And so molecular evidence provides really good evidence that evolution is happening. It really is the evidence that we use the most, because now we have the ability to sequence the DNA to see what the actual base codes or protein sequence is and compare it to others and see how closely related organisms are and perhaps how long ago they actually speciated. So that's the evidence that we use the most now. And that's why molecular evidence is in the center of your notes, because DNA evidence is the strongest evidence for evolution that we have. Take a moment to summarize why molecular evidence would be evidence for evolution, and use your textbook if you need to. All right. You do need to go back and check your notes guide for your textbook and just be sure you've covered everything. I hope that's very helpful, and I will see you very soon. Stay safe and healthy. I'll see you soon.